Hi everyone, welcome to today's assessment of China's BRI speaker series talk as part of the UVA's assessment of China's BRI project here at UVA, which has been supported by a number of different organizations, including the Center for Global Innovation and Inquiry, the East Asia Studies Center at UVA, and a generous gift by Mr. McConnell. Today we are joined by Dr. Filippo Boni from the Open University in the United Kingdom. Dr. Filippo is an assistant professor, a lecturer as it's known in the UK, at the Open University in the United Kingdom. He has written extensively on the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and he's published a book which I've had the pleasure of reviewing as well. If you've not read it, please do get the book and read it. But the book looks at the evolving dynamics of China-Pakistan bilateral relations in view of Pakistan's particular political economy. Dr. Boni is going to talk to us today about negotiating the Belt and Road Initiative, agency, domestic politics, and the China-Pakistan economic corridor. All of these topics are extremely important, in my opinion, in order to understand China's interaction with countries across the global south, because too often the idea is that China goes into these countries, gives money, and basically gets what it wants out of the policymakers within these countries. The reality, as Dr. Boni's talk today will show, is much more complex. There are a number of different sort of variables and factors and actors within these countries that have an impact on how these countries sort of react to Chinese overtures in terms of investments in infrastructure or investments in different sectors of the economy as well. So without further ado, it's over to you, Filippo. Welcome to UVA, and we're excited to hear your talk, and to hear about your thesis. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Muhammad Tayyab. I mean, it's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon for you, this evening for me here in the UK in Oxford, and thank you so much for inviting me to give this presentation. It's really a great pleasure. So I'll start sharing my screen in the hope that the last 18 months of doing things online have taught me how to do that. Can you see it? Okay, so it should be. Okay, so as Tayyab was saying in his introduction, today I will try to touch on a few points that bring together some of my recent work on the China-Pakistan economic corridor and on the Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan. Just to give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about over the next half an hour or so, I'll first start with sort of outlining the approach and the analytical angle that informs a lot of my work on the topic. I will then move to look at what is CPEC and why it matters. I'm sure that, I mean, most of you will be familiar with it, but I think it's important to emphasize, I mean, its relevance in the wider BRI landscape. So why should we care about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and why it's an important case, especially across the myriad of projects, countries that are involved with the Belt and Road Initiative. I'll then look at sort of trying to go a bit beyond what we normally read, not just in the news, but also in a lot of the academic literature, trying to foreground in a way Pakistan's agency in the way in which CPEC has been negotiated. And in this presentation, I will also do so by looking at 4 case studies. One will be the emphasis on coal in the first phase of CPEC as far as energy generation is concerned. The second case would be the alignment of the Pakistan-China Economic Corridor, so essentially where projects have been cited and all of the dynamics surrounding these discussions. The third case will be the port of Gwadar, which it's often in the spotlight for many reasons that I will explain also later on. And the fourth case will be the sort of change in leadership and how the elections in 2018 and the change of government and the main party in government really provided some different backdrop to the relationship and how China adapted to it, because that's another important point that I will try to sort of emphasize in this presentation. And then I will draw some very brief and final conclusions about what this tells us about wider discussions on the BRI. So before I go on into the sort of more content part of the presentation, a lot of the material that I will present today comes from three main publications, two of which are with Professor Catherine Adeney at the University of Nottingham. One came out in May with Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which looks at how Pakistan and China negotiate, and a lot of the discussion today will be based on that research. Another part of today's presentation draws on another paper in Asian Survey, which looked at the impact of CPEC on Pakistan's federal system, and also on some parts of it will be based on the book whose paperback edition came out just earlier this summer. So this is to give a sense of where a lot of the findings and the insights that I'm going to present today are coming from. And I mean, it's important to try and have this discussion about the negotiations around the Belt and Road Initiative, because there is often discussions about the BRI, how it gets caught in the US-China Cold War, as this title here in the slide sort of seems to suggest. And Pakistan in particular, it's one of those flashpoints and battlegrounds globally where this competition seems to be quite evident. An example of this were, for instance, the remarks that Ambassador Alice Wells made on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in 2019. She was very vocal in expressing the US's administration criticism towards CPEC in terms of the lack of transparency, of job opportunities that were provided. So this was a very, very strong statement that was made by the US administration. And I think it tells us how CPEC really plays out, and it's important in wider debates that we're looking at in international relations as well. The academic literature also started looking at at Pakistan's shift towards towards China more and more so since the CPEC was announced, and there has been a vibrant debate within Pakistan and the policymaking community there about whether it's a sensible move to align ever more closely with China, especially at the time when the United States and the West have withdrawn from Afghanistan. So really, I mean, this is just to give a sense of, the debate. It's a lot around the geopolitical implications, the regional implications about the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. But I think less attention has been devoted to trying to understand how these projects really unfold on the ground and the mechanics with which these projects actually are implemented. And this is sort of the angle that the entry point that I take in a lot of my work on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And I'll just try to outline why I think this is an important way to look at it, and briefly also the methods before we dive into the more specific details regarding the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. First of all, I think that focusing on the domestic politics in host countries where BRI projects are being implemented, it gives us, the opportunity to understand how these projects are internalized in domestic political dynamics. As Tayyab was saying in his introductory remarks, there is often the impression that China parachutes essentially these investments into host countries that have little say in the way in which then projects operate and unfold on the ground. Actually, that's not true, as I will try to show in today's presentation. So adopting a more relational approach to how the BRI plays out, I think it helps us really foreground the variety of actors involved in negotiation and the implementation of projects from both the Chinese and the recipient side. And the sort of final point is that by looking at BRI projects through this lens, it allows for a more granular approach that enables a better appreciation of the agency that partner countries have in shaping how the BRI unfolds on the ground. And sort of the core argument of today's talk, it's really to try and foreground the agency that Pakistan had on a number of case studies, on the ones that I've mentioned in the introductory slide, in the outline. Because again, Pakistan, it's one of those cases where, in light of the power asymmetry that you would have between the two countries, which is not unique to Pakistan, of course, so some of these findings might travel as well to other contexts as well. There is often the impression that China gets, manages to do whatever it wants and whatever it pleases. It's actually not the case, and I hope that the evidence presented today will sort of shed light on this important aspect in a nuanced way. In terms of methodology, as I've mentioned, a lot of the research here, it's sort of it has been conducted jointly with Professor Catherine Adeney. A lot of the material comes from semi-structured elite interviews during 3 rounds of fieldwork in Pakistan in 2015, 2018, and 2021. These have been triangulated with primary and secondary sources, and a lot of the official reports from committee meetings. And so, I mean, it's been the substance comes both from again interviews, but also from a number of official reports that are quite useful, as I hope to show in the next few slides. So before CPEC, a brief overview of China-Pakistan relations. The ties were established in 1951. This year we've seen quite a few events celebrating the 70th anniversary of establishing diplomatic ties. It was essentially founded on the anti-India orientation of both countries, which is an aspect that I think it's often emphasized in the way in which Sino-Pakistani relations are presented, as opposed to US-Pakistan relations. So with China, there is often the rhetoric around the fact that it was able to help and to be on Pakistan's side at critical junctures that mostly overlap with conflicts with India. And it sort of, whereas with the US, the story is a bit different, and the accusation there is that it's not be a reliable partner at times of crisis. It's a relationship that has been mostly revolving around elite-to-elite interactions, at least until the China-Pakistan economic corridor was implemented, as well as, and in particular, on military-to-military ties, which is an argument that I develop extensively in the book. So the Belt and Road Initiative and coming to Pakistan through CPEC really represents a watershed moment in bilateral ties, as they add an economic dimension to what was almost exclusively a security relationship. And there is also a grassroots element added to it that I won't discuss in today's presentation, but that Tayyab has covered excellently in his paper, which is part of the same Carnegie series, that the paper with my paper and Catherine's paper is also part of. So if you haven't had the chance, I'd really encourage you to have a look at that, because it's really great. So to wrap up this overview of the Pakistan-China relationship, I think, and to give you a sense of where it's headed, it's useful to compare it with the US. And China's been the major arms supplier to Pakistan since 2011, and most notably since 2013. And to this, there has been sort of also the trade ties between the two countries have expanded significantly. But the trade balance, or rather the trade imbalance between Pakistan and China, has also grown as a result, in part, of some of the CPEC related imports. And I'm happy to take a few questions later on about this. So the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. A couple of pictures, I think, tell the whole story of what we've seen, or a good chunk of the story of what we've seen with CPEC so far. The first picture, the one at the top, it's one of the first coal-fired power plants that was built under the aegis of CPEC. And the second one is a picture that I took when visiting Lahore. And it's not the best picture, but it gives you an indication of what is actually being built, and that's the orange line. So it's an urban transportation system. So it's really about energy and big infrastructure projects. By now, we all know that CPEC has been defined as the flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative. It was defined as such by the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. It's interesting here how the sort of rhetoric and the announcements around the sums involved with CPEC investments are often quite different from the reality on the ground. There's often a sort of mismatch between the two. We've seen claims of investments going from 46 billion in 2015, when President Xi Jinping visited Pakistan to officially launched the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Then these numbers have gone up to 62 billion. What we're actually seeing is something around 25 billion of projects either completed or under construction, which is still a huge amount of money. This is not to downplay the importance, it's just to sort of recalibrate a little bit what are some of the headlines around and the hype around the investments surrounding CPEC. The lion's share in the first phase went to energy projects as well as infrastructure ones, whereas the second phase is more related to the special economic zones, to the development of the industrial base in Pakistan, and on socioeconomic development, in line with the agenda of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, which is the sort of leading party, the ruling party at the moment. And this is a point that I'll sort of touch on in towards the final part of the presentation. So the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, it's quite an interesting case, I think, also because it's one of the most institutionalized decision-making processes that, you know, involves, on the one hand, China's National Development and Reform Commission on the Chinese side, and Pakistan Planning, Development and Reform, the Planning Commission of Pakistan on the other. And this is really the beating heart, if you like, of the decision-making process. There are a number of sub-working groups. A few more have been added to the ones that you can see here, exchange note and then make recommendations for the final decisions that are made in the JCC. So this is important, and we'll go back to it to see, because it's really through this institutional framework that we were able to sort of unearth some of the dynamics around the negotiations for CPEC. So the first case that I'll discuss today, it's the relationship, the fact that a lot of the first phase electricity projects were coal power plants. And again, here too is often the impression that this is China, something that China is willing to push on the host countries of BRI projects. And I think it's also important in light of the recent announcement by the Chinese president that China would stop essentially building coal-fired projects abroad. As far as Pakistan is concerned, this is the table of the first phase energy projects, which are all coal-fired power plants. 8 out of 17, so 47% of these projects are coal-fired power plants, and they account for roughly the 65% of the megawatts that are going to be or have already been injected into the grid to sort of address the electricity shortages. But was it really Chinese priority? Was it a Pakistani priority? And from the research that we've conducted, we found out, and this is definitely not something that it's an isolated case in Pakistan, the strong focus on energy generation was primarily driven by Pakistan on domestic priorities. The priority number one was to address electricity shortages that were severely affecting the country's economy, but as well as everyday lives. The second one was the fact that the focus on coal was part of Pakistan's desire to diversify its energy mix, and this was outlined in the national power policy that was issued in 2013. And it was also an important, the fact that Pakistan, the Pakistani leadership at the time decided to invest on energy generation was essentially a way, they saw it as a ticket to re-election, basically. So delivering on the promise to end the energy crisis was what would have meant being re-elected. Things have turned out slightly differently in the end, but at least originally, that was the rationale. So here what we see is that a lot of the decisions around the type of project, the nature of the project, and so on and so forth are coming not exclusively or not necessarily from the Chinese side, but they are actually Pakistani priorities. And I think this is an important point for the reasons that I was outlining at the beginning to sort of foreground agency. Another example, and the sort of second case that I want to look at today, it's the discussion around the impact that CPEC had on Pakistan's federal system. This is a map which is from 2019, and hopefully you can see that a lot of the projects are located on the part of Pakistan sort of bordering India, whereas so there is a bit of an imbalance there in terms of where the projects are located. And here too, what our research found is that it's a combination of interests where Pakistan had agency in the way in which things played out. So the siting was primarily distributed in Punjab and Sindh and in Gwadar as well, with fewer projects that were allocated, at least initially, to Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And this suited both the interests of the then ruling party as well as the Chinese side. The ruling party was happy to have a lot of these projects coming through constituencies of its members that were in parliament at the time. And as I was noting before, this was also seen as a good way to deliver on the promises made in the election campaign. And China had expressed earlier, as it emerged from interviews that I did in Pakistan since 2015, that China was happy to work on some of the areas of Pakistan that were a bit more economically viable, if you like, rather than Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So an evidence of this comes from some of the minutes of the JCC meeting that we were able to access. Essentially, the two sides, this is a quote, the two sides really reached consensus on the alignment of CPEC, which includes mostly cities in Punjab, Sindh, and in Gwadar, which is the sort of next case we're going to look at, and really one of the key projects in this China-Pakistan economic corridor. And this is something that was coming mostly from the Chinese side, and which was agreed by the chair of the National Development and Reform Commission. So the idea to make full use of existing transport infrastructure. So not building it from scratch, but to start working on something that was already there. So again, here, I hope that this shows in a way how it's a combination of interest, and it's a meeting somewhere halfway through that eventually saw the implementation as we see it today. So it's not the imposition of China's will on Pakistan. On the contrary, it's actually the result of negotiations within an institutionalized decision-making framework. The port of Gwadar, it's the sort of next example, and this is one of the most recent pictures I could find. And you can see a lot of these new buildings that you see here, the yellow one. These are relatively new warehouses that were built recently. So there has been some progress being made there. And here too, Gwadar often make the headlines because there are speculations whether it's going to be a military base, whether China has a strategic interest in it. But if we look at actually how Gwadar came to be the sort of jewel in the crown, if you like, of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the first concrete proposal came from Pakistan during President Musharraf's visit to China in 2000. And China at the time was quite skeptical to invest in the port for a number of reasons that still represent issues today. So issues of connectivity, issue of separatist movements, threatening the security of this project. So there were questions around the economic viability of the project, essentially, which have not gone away completely. But still, it's a Pakistani initiative to which China then got on board. It invested in the first phase, which was completed in 2006. The operations then were given to the Port of Singapore Authority between 2007, 2008 to 2013, and then back to China when the CPEC was, when the first MOUs around the CPEC were announced. So to signify the importance that Gwadar has in the wider CPEC landscape, most of the investments in the port or in the area are either interest-free loans or grants, which is quite in stark contrast with some of the most common financing tools that are used, so concessional loans on the other CPEC projects. And this is evidence of China's desire both to meet Pakistani demands, to have the port of Gwadar as a potential alternative to Karachi, but also as an access, as a gateway to Central Asia and Afghanistan. And but at the same time, of course, I mean, Chinese interests are there, and the investment in Gwadar, it's also to pursue China's own strategic considerations to develop what a lot of analysts consider a strategic strong point in the Indian Ocean. So here too, it's not, the idea, it's not that China is just pushing projects through. It's actually, again, here a story that was initiated by Pakistan, to which China then went on board progressively. The final case, it's how the change in leadership changed the way in which the China-Pakistan economic corridor developed on the ground. Here, I think it's important to note both the fact that Pakistan had agency in the way in which things unfolded, as I will show in a minute, but also the adaptability that China has in the way in which operates in different contexts and with different actors. So trying to develop as many political, economic, social, military touch points so that China is able to deal with the mutated political circumstances on the ground. This is a picture that portrays former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, with Chinese President Xi Jinping during the visit in April 2015. and really relations between the PMLN and the Chinese leadership were really great. And some of the headlines here are quite interesting, I think. The Shenzhen speed is past, Punjab speed is present, so to testify how keen the leadership in the province was to sort of push ahead with these projects. The ambassador of China before the elections endorses CPEC and praises Shahbaz Sharif, who is the brother of former prime minister. So really very cordial ties, which are a bit different from what we saw with the PTI, which is the current ruling party, especially in sort of the run-up to the 2018 elections, but also because the PTI was quite vocal in expressing its criticism around the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Imran Khan has, alongside the former chief minister of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, conveyed reservations around CPEC to the Chinese ambassador. This is part of a protest, of a massive protest that the PTI staged against the government, but there were speculations that might have been also against CPEC, so they had to sort of calm the waters a little bit, saying, well, this is not against CPEC, and in a meeting with the Chinese ambassador. So it wasn't on the same ground or on the same footing that like the relationship that China had with the PMLN. So what are the implications? So eventually the PTI went on to win the 2018 elections. And with the change in leadership came a change in priorities. And so I think it's important to look at how there's been also a shift in the way in which CPEC was framed and portrayed, not just from the Pakistani side, but also from the Chinese side. And the Chinese diplomats in Pakistan were trying in the immediate aftermath of the election to sort of try and go along the lines of the priorities that the new government was bringing, focus more on socioeconomic development, less on big infrastructure projects. So before the 2018 elections, there was, again, focus more on infrastructure. After the 2018 election, more on socioeconomic development. There were no massive announcements of new infrastructure projects apart from perhaps the railway line from Karachi to Peshawar, but also that has seen delays. So it was more on small scale projects that would promote the industrialization of Pakistan and the socioeconomic development of the country. I think what it's interesting to show also the adaptability that China has with a number of interlocutors that they have. Before the 2018 elections, it was mostly with the PMLN government that the relationship was quite close and well oiled. After 2018 and the first sort of not disagreements, but issues with the government, with the new government, China returned in a way to what was the pre-CPEC playbook of dealing primarily with the Pakistani military, and this was reflected also in the decision-making process, which still has the Joint Cooperation Committee at the very heart, but a number of other institutional decision-making bodies have been added to it that see at the helm members of the military. So, for instance, the CPEC authority, it's no longer the case, I think, since the last 2-3 months, where things have slightly changed on that, but it's still an additional layer of bureaucracy and a way to sort of get more military involvement in the way in which these projects are run. So in addition to the change in priorities, there's a change also in the mechanics of the relationship, which I think it's interesting to sort of look at in the context of Pakistan. So I'll draw some final thoughts and conclusions so that we can have then enough space for the Q&A. The first one, I think that again, going back to one of the points that I was making at the beginning, the findings presented here are really in line with other cases. For instance, Malaysia, And so it's really important to look at political actors in BRI recipient or host countries, whatever you may call them, as they really, there's really a lot of evidence suggesting that these are key actors in the way in which projects unfold on the ground. The core point sort of that was trying to make, and that I hope was clear from by going through the 4 case studies, the 4 examples, if you like, was that the importance of looking at the BRI as being informed and shaped both by the interest of Chinese actors and the agendas of domestic partners. And this is why there are implications for Chinese foreign policy and debates around China's principle of non-interference, but also wider debates about whether, how China engages globally with a number of countries. And sort of, I think this type of approaches and research can help us provide more nuanced understandings of how things work, especially at the time where we see a growing polarization of debates, a growing contestation between the 2 great powers, the US and China. So I think it's really important to look to try and provide nuanced understandings of what happens on the ground that then can be reflected in the way in which policymakers and the general public understand this new great power rivalry. So I think I'll stop here, and thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Filippo. Excellent talk. Lots and lots to think about. I would ask you to please, raise your hand using the buttons available. If you want to ask your question, please introduce yourself, unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask your question.
There are none. I don't have any.
Hi, Mary. So while we wait for the audience to ask questions, Filippo, I thought it was very interesting, your talk. So one of the things that Professor Adjani talks about a lot in her research is this hybrid regime. And of course, after 2018, one of the major things as far as Pakistan's concerned is the rise of this hybrid regime where both the military and the civilians in many ways are partners. So while the face of the regime is largely civilian, but rather than being a subordinate relationship, it is one of partnership. So one of the things that you highlighted is the increasing role of the military post 2018. So one of the things that I'm exploring in my research is whether this, one of the main planks of the relationship between China and Pakistan being the military, whether this expansion in relations actually contributed to a rethinking within the military about the relationship. So how does that play out in this post 2018 scenario where you point out that the military sort of takes the helm as far as decision making is concerned?
Thanks. That's a really good question and a difficult one to answer. So I'm not sure whether I have a definitive answer. I think that'd be great to have a conversation as well with you on this. So my sense is that at one level, Pakistan, at least formally, has shifted its foreign policy significantly towards China. Something that, whereas until probably 2011, 2012, and historically, Pakistan's foreign policy has been always, in a way, in between the US and China, if you like. Now what we see is that a progressive shift towards Beijing. And behind this shift, I think there's the idea coming from the military that China is really a security partner, a reliable one that Pakistan can count on. At the same time, though, there's also the impression that there has been some signaling that Pakistan does not want to lose completely the United States. And again, here, a lot of the signaling is coming from some of the top military leaders. So on the one hand, again, we see a decisive shift towards China, but at the same time, it's something that Pakistan realizes it doesn't want or it cannot lose completely the United States. So it would be interesting to explore more how this sort of reflects, whether it reflects at all different viewpoints that might emerge from within the institution, the military as an institution, which is often looked at as a monolithic entity. But I mean, instead, I think there are different voices and different viewpoints, like in any organization. So that's potentially quite an interesting thing to look at. And I'm sorry, I don't have a definitive answer, but I think it's just, just my thought around, I mean, this sort of, foreign policy orientation and how it reflects perhaps some of the views within the institution.
Thank you. I think it is a difficult question to answer. So another question, which is from our audience, Singwan asks, and I think this is an increasingly important question as far as the China-Pakistan economic corridor is concerned and the relationship between China and Pakistan is concerned. Is this rising attacks on Chinese interests within Pakistan as well? So we've seen attacks in Balochistan, but we've also seen attacks in other parts of Pakistan, including in Karachi, as well as on the Dasu Dam in the northern areas. So how does this? So what are the motives? So this is from the participant. What are the motives of these attackers on Chinese interests within Pakistan? And if I was to expand it a little further, so the impact of this instability in Afghanistan, how does that sort of play out as far as the China-Pakistan relationship is concerned? Because I was just reading something today that the Chinese are not really very happy with the security situation in Pakistan as well.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the motives, I think China in this case, it's potentially a proxy for the Pakistani state, that it's the real target of a number of these groups, whether they're separatist movements, whether the TTP, it's the Pakistani state essentially the main target, and of course, given the crucial importance that China has now in Pakistan's economy, in the politics of Pakistan as well, there's no greater and bigger target and most visible one as well than attacking Chinese nationals working in the country, whether it's on CPEC projects or on non-CPEC projects, because some of the latest attacks have been on workers that were not necessarily working on CPEC projects. So it's something that it's really, again, my take on this is that this is not something that, again, it's not on China because it's against China, but China is a target and a proxy to sort of undermine the credibility and the stability of the Pakistani state, given the deep and close relationship that it has with China. The instability in Afghanistan, yes, that's, I think, I also read something along those lines about the fact that China is not too happy with the way in which security it's now in Pakistan. And I think it was, and for someone who's been following CPEC since it wasn't even called CPEC, because I started working on it since 2013, when it was really, an economic corridor. I think also in the language that we've seen surrounding the narrative, if you like, around CPEC, the latest report of the Joint Cooperation Committee, if you compare the last one with the ones from 2015, 2016, what you see now is a lot of emphasis on security. And so China demanding security and Pakistan saying, yes, we are we are providing it, we are doing all we can. This is something that was really marginal, I think, in between 2014 and 2018. And I think it's a reflection, it's one of the sort of trickle-down effects of what's happening with the security of certain projects. And the stability in Afghanistan, it's certainly a big concern for China, as far as its projects in Pakistan are concerned, of course.
Thank you very much, Filippo. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Okay, so while we wait for questions, Filippo, there's lots that I can ask you, my own interest in the topic. But one of the questions that I've been very interested in is, so when we talk about agency of local actors, one of the questions on a more theoretical sort of a plane that I've been interested in is, what is the extent of this agency? So what are those red lines in this interaction between an emerging great power and these host economies on which it is in many ways dependent, but it is an asymmetrical relationship, because the great power, of course, has economic resources. It also has coercive resources which are superior as compared to these host economies. So the question that I'm sort of interested in is, what are those sort of red lines as far as this emerging great power is concerned, in terms of trying to accommodate agency of these diverse local actors, but then also safeguarding its own interests in many ways as well. So what's that sort of line? Is it a project-based line that is that sort of red line between between local and global interests, or is it a more sort of a opaque sort of a red line which sort of sort of plays out as these projects are negotiated or implemented on the ground?
Thanks. That's another very interesting question that I've also been asking myself as I was going through the for instance, the JCC meeting, trying to figure out and the notes and the committee reports. So I mean, where did they draw the line essentially, and why, and what were the reasons? And I mean, my impression is that it's a lot like the sort of the last part of your question. So it's really, I don't think there is a pattern or a framework that you can apply to all contexts. It's a lot depending on the individual project, on the specific project. So in a way, again, I think the alignment of the corridor, it's a good example where, I mean, China would be happy to invest in Pakistan, especially at the time. 2013 wasn't the easiest time for Pakistan, both internationally and, in terms of economically. So having a country like China that decides, okay, this is, we would like to, to invest in Pakistan at that time, I think it was something really, really important. So the alignment of the corridor really, it's again a story where political interest on the local side would meet Chinese interest on the other. I'm not sure whether if the Pakistani side had pushed for having, roads built from scratch in Balochistan or KP, whether we would have seen agency to that level. So I think it's a matter of course, trying to accommodate as much as possible, but there are also some clear priorities that China has, maybe not as a general pattern countrywide, but on some specific projects, it's clear. So you want to build a road which is, in either Punjab or Sindh because it's more economically viable, because it has much more potential in terms of industrialization farther down the line, and so on and so forth. So I think these have been the considerations behind China's decision go into the JCC and suggest that this was going to be the case. And of course, it encountered Pakistan's, own agendas and desire, especially from the PMLN. So again, it's a combination, and it's difficult. I think it has to be assessed on a case by case, because I wasn't able really to identify a pattern running through the entire process of negotiation. So there are red lines, but they're not. They move as projects and negotiations advance.
Right. Thank you very much, Filippo. Another question which comes to mind, which sort of flows from this question of agency, and you touched upon it a little bit in terms of, and your paper with Catherine also talks about it, the one on federalism. So you touched upon how, economically, the urban centers in Sindh and Punjab, which are the urban centers, the population centers, or the nerve centers as far as Pakistan's economy is concerned, that's where most of the Chinese money has flowed at the moment. But given your understanding of Pakistan's federal character, how is, so again, and I'll qualify this question a little more as well as I go along, what does it mean for the smaller federating units, especially Balochistan, where of course Gwadar is such a large part, or is ostensibly seen as a large part of the story as far as the BRI and CPEC is concerned. With respect to KPK, a lot of the money that's come in, or a lot of the firms that have partnered with large Chinese firms, the money has primarily been from entrepreneurs in KPK as opposed to, the more established ones in Karachi and Sindh. So again, this sort of private investment that has emerged, or these private linkages, which I think commentators like Andrew Small have dismissed to a large extent, but I think once again, it's more complex than dismissing them outrightly. How do they sort of play out into this broader China-Pakistan relationship? Because as you rightly point out, it's not only these few actors. As the relationship has expanded, other actors within Pakistan have become a part of it as well.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point, and I think that, I mean, if we look at the sort of some of the business groups as well that were part of the, that were involved with CPEC, there were some analysis suggesting that essentially the shift in some of the priorities around CPEC was also related to some of the interest groups that were more linked to the PTI and that were unhappy with the way in which the way in which the PMLN handled the China-Pakistan economic corridor, because it excluded them. So so essentially, I think this is something that it's really it's an important layer to look at, and they've certainly played an important role now in the second phase, which is more about special economic zones and industrialization. I think they are really some of the key actors to try and sort of look at a little bit more. I haven't come across much research that has been done on this type of political economy level of these actors that play a role within CPEC. So I'd be very interested to explore that as well as as an additional component that has been added to the relationship as CPEC was progressing. And we've seen also, I mean, some of the, for instance, in the implementation of some of the highway projects in the first phase, we've seen some joint ventures between some Pakistani groups and some some Chinese firms, some military-linked organizations. So the political economy of who's involved with CPEC on the ground, it's really diverse, and it's a really interesting landscape and layer that needs to be accounted for when we discuss about it. And so yeah, I think that's a very good point and an interesting one to follow up on as well.
And on Balochistan and this, the further marginalization of these
Sorry, yes,
peripheral
yes.
areas.
Yes, sorry, that's here too. I think when we look at the BRI and we discuss and we say that some of these projects have been internalized, I think it's an important lens, because it would be easy to say that it's Chinese investments that have led to some separatist sentiments. Of course, we know that this is something that pre-exists the BRI, and what CPEC projects have done have added an additional layer of complexity to an already rather tense relationship. My impression, I've never been to Balochistan, so it's difficult for me. I can base my assessment on on a lot of sources, but my impression is that it has CPEC on the one hand has exacerbated a lot of the pre-existing tensions because of the lack of buy-in from local stakeholders that were feeling marginalized before and probably feel marginalized even more so now as a result of the lack of inclusion in the decision-making process. If we look at the JCC again, provincial chief ministers were not included up until I think the 5th or 6th. So basically the first 3-4 years, it was very difficult for them to access the actual levers of power. So I think that's something that and it's also one of the recommendations that we make in the report. It's sort of to have this local buy-in in order to mitigate some of these issues. But to an extent, things seem to be moving a bit in that direction now with desalination plants that have been built. I was reading the other day about training center, vocational training center in Gwadar, although that also raises question marks because I mean it's a vocational training. What does that mean? What type of model is being implemented? Is it with all that's going on with the discussions around China's surveillance in Xinjiang and so on? So is it something similar, different? So I mean it's difficult to gauge the real extent of of trying to win hearts and minds, essentially, of local communities. But I think that would be absolutely crucial if CPEC has to be a success in the long run, to have this buy-in from those who are actually going, hopefully, to benefit from a lot of these investments.
Thank you, Filippo. Last question, and I think then we can end this extremely interesting webinar. So I was looking at the book that you mentioned before we started the webinar, and within the blurb it was written that the sort of advantages of CPEC for China are likely to be more strategic rather than economic. So you talk about the expansion of CPEC or CPEC being a success. What does success look like? And I think that's a question that I often think about myself when I talk to people in Islamabad or across Pakistan. What does success mean? What is it the same for the Pakistanis and the Chinese, or is it different? What are the parameters of success as far as economic corridors are concerned? Because again, the wider literature talks about economic corridors from a different sort of a perspective, which is more focused on the economy and on economic activity as opposed to the way that we've come to think about CPEC.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Another thing, and I'll start from the end. Another thing that I think that a lot of literature on economic corridors in general, coming from the Asian Development Bank and all these studies, I think one of the things that they mention is that economic corridors do not function in isolation. So they need to be well integrated within the region. And if we look at CPEC, and that's an indicator of success, I'm afraid that that's not something that we really see now. I mean, India, it's a no-go, and all the talks about CPEC's extension to Afghanistan. Well, I think now it's really difficult to see that happening. So I think that the first point, if we take some of these benchmarks to assess what success would mean, on that side, it's a bit of a negative assessment so far. On the other hand, we need to look at why CPEC, what were the main motives at the beginning? Energy shortages. As far as I'm aware, I mean, the situation has improved quite significantly in a lot of parts of the country. So on that grounds, CPEC has been a success. Whether then there are questions of debt around the repayment of the loans around, you know, the power plants, that's another story. But I think if we look at the actual, some of the concrete benefits of CPEC, that's a positive sign. So success, I think the starting point would be to have a look at what was announced in 2013 or in 2015. And since we're now if we take 2015 as the starting point, we're now 6 years down the line, we are able to measure whether some of these benefits have really come through. And I think on some, we would be able to say, well, it has been, it has been effective in addressing what it was meant to do. In other areas, no. Whether China was looking a complete return on its investments, I'm not sure that's something that can be considered a success. Whether, again, I think there are many areas we can look at. So if we look at the integration in the region, not particularly successful. If we look instead at the concrete impact on some grounds it has it leveled up all the internal inequalities and differences within Pakistan and among the various provinces? Probably not, but it was probably too ambitious to think, and in this sense, some of the claims that it was going to be a game changer, it was, but a lot of people put their hopes into CPEC that were probably a bit too ambitious than what was actually what the project was actually able to deliver eventually. So I think it's difficult to give a definitive answer. I think we need to look at different areas and what were the main aims at the beginning of CPEC. What was it meant to do, and sort of assess it from there.
Great, thank you so much, Filippo. I know it's late in the UK; it's 9:30 now over there, so we'll not take much of your time. Thank you very much for joining us. And I hope that we can have a conversation hopefully soon as well. And it was a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to you, Tayyab, and thanks for having me and for your questions and insights. And I look forward to keeping the conversation going. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Filippo. And I'll send you an email and then let's have a conversation.